I want you to imagine what Trump would look like in a polygamous society, right? So instead of having just 3 wives and 2 divorces, he's going to have 100 wives on every floor, or one on each floor of Trump Tower, and he's going to have 10 kids with each of these wives. He's going to have thousands of children, hundreds of wives, and it's just going to complete moral debacle. Here in the United States, the median male wage since 1970 has actually fallen 3%, and among those without a college education, it's fallen 7%. Meanwhile, for those males with a college education, it's risen like 40%. And that's just the men's side. Then when you look on the women's side, women of all skill levels have seen their wages go up.
All these men wouldn't be able to monopolize on short-term mating strategies if there were not enough women that would be willing to entertain it.
And it's horrendous. You just see bankruptcies go up, credit card debt go up, financial stress go up. And not only that, but guess who's it's affecting the most? It is young men, the exact same young men that I was just talking about, that need to get their lives together. There's a reason why California has spent $10 billion and hasn't laid a mile of track on their high-speed bullet train, right? It's just ridiculous. Income inequality, wealth inequality, decrease of social mobility, crime, isolation, demographic decline. These are all caused by the decline of marriage, and they all undermine democracy. Choosing between married to the state and married to a man has just been a disaster.
We are just days away from President Trump taking the office again. And in the run-up to the election, there was an awful lot of noise in the commentary about the voting intention of minority groups and majority groups. How are the white people going to vote? How are Hispanics going to vote? But in your book, you actually draw a potentially more even important distinction of how married and single people vote. So can you kind of talk us through it? Because I find that this is one of the sort of axes of difference of opinion that people don't really talk about.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And it is, I think, one of the biggest political divides that is out there that people don't recognize. Basically, when you look at the exit polls from the most recent election, you can see that married men voted overwhelmingly for Trump, 60-40%. Then you had married women, slightly less, but still overwhelmingly supporting Trump, 55-45. Then you had single men supporting Trump by about 52-48. But then switching that, the only set of demographic out of those 4 that voted for Democrats were single women. And they voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. And this has been growing over time, not just in the politicization and the polarization of single women, but the growth of single women. Single women are the fastest growing demographic. And actually this, for the United States, this past presidential election was the first time ever that there were more single women voting than married women voting. And you might think, oh, wow, how can you have more single women than single men voting? And it's just because as long as women have been voting, they vote more often than men. So you have the single men just don't go to the polls as often as single women, which is why political wise, single women carry such weight, especially. And this is when you look at Kamala Harris on all of those crazy positions she had to walk back during the election, whether it's transgender surgery or decriminalizing the border, those are all super popular among single white women, single women. And it's because the Democratic Party is so controlled and so dominated by single women. That is what has really pushed the party so far to the left, at least here in this country.
I think it's really fascinating because then suddenly you start to maybe understand some of their choices and some of the really crazy policies that Democrats have been leaning into for years and years, because on the face of it, they don't really make sense. But when you actually start splitting the numbers in terms of the showing up for the voting, it's actually starting to make sense, even why she went on this podcast. Is it Call Me Daddy or
Right,
something?
Right.
And where all that she was constantly talking about is the abortion, when I think when you actually look at majority of Americans as a group, there isn't actually that much difference of opinion on where Americans stand on the abortion. But she was really leaning into it. And as you sort of explain, it's probably because she's leaning into those growing demographic that votes for them. And I think that growing demographic isn't going to be getting any smaller with the research that we've got, that young men are leaning more to the right as the time goes by, and the young women tend to lean more on the left. So that gap tends to be opening up. Is that what you sort of expect going in the future?
Yeah, I think that's going to play a large part of it. You have definitely women moving more to the left and men looking and seeing parties of the left, Democratic Party that's not open to them. I mean, you talked about Planned Parenthood. It was worse than that. They had a vasectomy van out in front of the Democratic National Convention. You're not going to get young men to sign up for your party by parking a literal vasectomy van at the entrance. That's not a selling point for young men. And so I think until they really reorientate themselves and start to think about what young men actually want, which is not marijuana legalization, which is not video games, which is not online sports betting. These are all vices that young men have, but it's not what they aspire to be. It's not the life they want to live. And what the life they want to lead, it's very simple. They want to make enough money to support a wife and get married and have children. And the Republican Party gets that. I mean, that's how they get Latino men and African American men to vote for them, because that is the ideal life for most minority men in the United States, is to make enough money to have a wife and have children. And that's what they aspire to. Not getting high and playing video games and betting on sports games. That's not what people want. But when you look at what the Democratic Party tried to implement, that's what they did. You had Tim Walz out there, playing video games. You had Kamala when she had that specific policy document about how to appeal to black men. It was like marijuana legalization was number one. It's like, no, these are not the issues that are going to motivate men to attach to your party and believe you are fighting for them. And, until that changes, I do think you're going to see more polarization among the younger age groups.
Mm-hmm. It will be interesting, especially in the States, to see the response of the Democratic Party, because Donald Trump has won everything that there was to win in terms of their election. So he's really got an open playing field now to change a lot of things. So going back to his administration, obviously he's got a very eccentric group of people around him, let's say that. How do you think his administration is going to approach the whole institution of marriage, and whether you foresee any plans for that administration to revive the institution of marriage?
Sure. So let me just take a small step back and say, I have a lot of Democratic friends and colleagues, more friends and family-ish. I grew up in Bay Area, Oakland, California, which is very liberal. And for them to say, like, how is the twice divorced, has been accused of so many cheating on his wife so many times, how is that guy going to be a hero of marriage? And the point is well taken. I get it. I understand the criticism. But really, the whole point of my book is to give some historical context to why monogamous marriage is so important. And so I asked these same people, it's like, I want you to imagine what Trump would look like in a polygamous society, right? So instead of having just 3 wives and 2 divorces, he's going to have 100 wives on every floor, or, one on each floor of Trump Tower. And he's going to have 10 kids with each of these wives. He's going to have thousands of children, hundreds of wives, and it's just going to complete moral debacle. And so I think that little thought experiment kind of gets into, why monogamous marriage is an institution that channels human sexuality, channels behavior into more productive behavior, into more cooperative behavior. So we're still flawed. We're still going to have people like Trump who do cheat on their spouses, do get divorced a couple of times, but still overall you have the institution channeling behavior in a proper direction. Now, moving to Trump's specific agenda, I don't think you're going to see a lot that specifically focuses on promotion of marriage. I think maybe you'll see J.D. Vance give some speeches and go into this more than Trump does specifically. But so much of Trump's agenda is already addressing the problem. And I think, kind of the 2 biggest ways you can look at this is both immigration and trade. Well, three, also permitting reform. But one of the main drivers of the decline of marriage, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, is the decline of male wages. Okay, I don't know the exact figures for the United Kingdom, but here in the United States, the median male wage since 1970 has actually fallen 3%. And among those without a college education, it's fallen 7%. Meanwhile, for those males with a college education, it's risen like 40%. That's just the men's side. Then when you look on the women's side, women of all skill levels have seen their wages go up. So it's really that deterioration of the relative wage of male wages, particularly low skill male wages going down, that you just don't have men, that there's not enough men to be marriageable for women, because women just, biologically, historically, evolutionary, we can get into those reasons later, women want a partner that is going to make at least as much as they do. And they're just not going to tolerate a man that can't support himself, that doesn't make as much as they do. And so as you have men's wages declining and female wages rising, you just get a larger and larger portion of men who aren't considered marriage eligible by women. So there's a number of ways that Trump is trying to fix this. Number one, illegal immigration. Illegal immigration drives down wages, especially for low skill people here in the United States. So shutting that valve off, deporting those who have criminal histories, that's going to help. Trade. The China's entrance into the World Trade Organization just devastated manufacturing across this country and male wages in particular. So Trump his plan there is to slowly amp up tariffs on Chinese goods to kind of wean America off that and support manufacturing here. Along those lines of manufacturing, construction is dominated by male workers, and so when you look at both housing construction, but transportation, all that is very much hamstrung by permitting process. It's very, very difficult in the United States to build things that involve the federal government because of a law called NEPA, the National Environmental Planning Act. And so, this bill adds, like 5 years and, $5 million onto every project. And so if you were able to reform that process, get rid of those delays, get rid of that extra cost, then you could have a country that's able to build things again, right? I mean, there's a reason why California has spent $10 billion and hasn't laid a mile of track on their high-speed bullet train, right? It's just ridiculous. This is a state that can't build anything. Meanwhile, Florida has built high-speed rail all the way from Miami to Orlando, and they're going to be going to Tampa soon. Red states are just a lot able to build more things because they don't have environmental regulations that have gone crazy, make it impossible to build anything. So all of those are ways in which Donald Trump is going to be helping marriage by raising male wages. Mm-hmm. But then there's some other items that I think you may see him, or at least other people in his administration, go after. I cover some of them in my book. Actually, I don't know what this is like in the United Kingdom, but here in the United States, legalized online gambling is relatively new for us. It's something whereas 10 years ago, you could watch a football game, our football, not your football, and you wouldn't see any advertising for online gambling because it just wasn't legal. And that's all changed because of the Supreme Court ruling in 2018. And now you try to watch any sports game here, and it's just online gambling forced down your throat all the time. Well, because of the uneven nature of how that regime became legalized in the States, there's lots of studies to look at, what is the effect of this? And it's horrendous. You just see bankruptcies go up, credit card debt go up, financial stress go up. And not only that, but guess who's it's affecting the most? It is young men, the exact same young men that I was just talking about, that need to get their lives together. They need to be able to find the job so that they can make themselves good enough so that a woman will want to be with them. Those are the same men they're suffering the most from online gambling. And then additionally, you have this week, the Supreme Court is hearing a case on a Texas law that slaps age verification on online pornography. And this is another area where you see, I don't think it's addictive as some people say, but there's definitely a lot of studies out there that show that the more a young male watches online pornography, the more they use that as a substitute for actual real human contact. And that's just terrible because men, I mean, my whole book's about channeling sexual behavior, and men should not be able to go online and have that easy sexual release. They should have to make themselves better, make themselves attractive, make themselves lovable, so that a real, actual, live woman will want to give them the physical intimacy that they are craving. And online pornography short circuits that. So you have Texas and I think it's 18 other states have age verification laws that just make it harder for everyone to go online to like porn, but it's basically there so that minors can't do it. But what happens when a lot of these laws are passed? Other pornography companies will just pull out entirely. So, for example, when age verification passed in Virginia, YouPorn just said, "Well, we're just going to pull out entirely instead of doing this age verification progress," which is great. We have one less online pornographer in the state. But there's then even more that the Trump administration could do. They could, go back and actually try to charge a lot of these pornographers with obscenity, which is still on the books. Now, there's a series of Supreme Court cases here in this country which really raised the bar, made it harder to prosecute and get a conviction for obscenity. But our Supreme Court is a lot more conservative now than it was when those standards were set. And I think those could be relitigated and lowered so that, at least when you have pornography, I talk about this in my book, there's an epidemic of choking going on college campuses.
Yeah.
Because men and women watch this porn and it has a lot of choking in it, and they think that's not only normal, but that women want it. And then women get choked and they're like, that really was not good. And that, it's that kind of really obscene stuff in pornography that has gotten out of hand, and really the federal government should step in.
I think it's the stat about the choking was I just couldn't believe what I heard, and I spoke to the sex therapist just sort of several weeks ago. That podcast was released, and I think she can't remember exactly, but I'll sort of quote it over here so that people can see. If I remember rightly, it was something around 25 or 30% of women reported unwanted choking in their last sexual encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Not ever, last. And that statistic just blew my mind. I couldn't believe it.
I think it's generational. I think you and I are like, what? But but it is. I mean, I do think it is almost entirely driven by what people see online.
In terms of the betting industry, the problem is the same in the UK. I think in states, obviously, you've got different states that have got a relative large field to adapt different policies in that state. In the UK, it works a little bit different. We've got essentially two parallel economies. There is London, and then there's the rest of the country.
Okay.
So a lot of what you were saying about the sort of the hollowing of opportunities for working class men, that is happening everywhere outside London, essentially. So a lot of the promises within the British politics about levelling up, it just stayed on paper, and essentially in rhetoric, it never really got implemented. And a lot of the disturbances that we've had over the summer, which probably made the news everywhere in the world, and the riots that we had, a lot of that was fueled by those disempowered men of working class who see immigration as part of the problem, a large part of the problem, why their lives look like they do. But in London, the situation is completely different. Now, I wouldn't be able to give you the statistics, but that divide is definitely there. In terms of the betting shops, the high street shops in all of the small towns, a lot of them will be boarded up or empty. And my estimate, and I don't think I would be far off, is on the typical high street of the town, you will have 2 or 3 betting shops.
Yeah,
so
no, I mean,
that just gives you an idea of just the problem in terms of the reach, because clearly these companies make enough money to make it pay for them.
Oh,
So
you can just tell by the amount of money they're pouring into advertising that, clearly someone's buying the product. Clearly, a lot of people are laying down money. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending that much money to advertise it. So,
yeah. So a lot of the problems that you talk about are obviously specifically American, but we see very much a mirror image in the UK. It might just look slightly different, but the causal effect are the same. So when we are talking about the government, dabbling into people's sex lives, there is that automatic response of, well, it's none of their bloody business, right? And even as I talk about it, like the government should control people's sort of sex lives, essentially, the automatic presumption is, well, that sounds like an overreach. And two of the aspects that are most commonly discussed when we are talking about things like that is the fact that it's consensual. So as long as it's consensual, everything goes. So I think that would be one of the most popular liberal ideas, I suppose. And then on the other hand is that if it doesn't harm anyone, then everything goes. Because if there is no harm, what's the problem? So let's talk about consent, first of all.
yeah, so I think consent is definitely important, but I just don't think it should be the end all and be all of maybe for criminality. But as far as what the government is trying to do to influence larger human behavior, for each individual encounter, consent just is not enough because there's so many other factors involved. That said, though, when you look at marriage, what makes Western marriage and what makes monogamy so worthwhile and such a institution that does serve the society well is that consent is at the heart of it. And this was not always the case throughout history. For most of human history, you had very patriarchal systems that kind of forced people into different marriages, etc. And it really wasn't until you had the Catholic Church come along and kind of break up these patriarchal polygamous clan structures that consent really became the basis of monogamy and human relations going forward. And as I detail in the book, the church accomplished this in a number of ways. This isn't even my theory. This is from Joseph Heinrich, who is a Harvard professor. But when you look at the church throughout the Middle Ages, they enforced what he calls a marriage and family program to kind of push men away from polygamy and patriarchal structures into more of a reciprocal monogamy. And these policies included just an outright ban on polygamy, a ban on inheritance to illegitimate offspring, but then moving to more of a consent, which has always been a very fundamental part of church doctrine, a ban on arranged marriages, and then also a ban on cousin marriages, because just so many of the cousin marriages were arranged marriages by powerful families in order to, get that wealth captured within the family. So consent is very important, but it's not something that the state should be, making the bottom line for all sexual relations. It should be trying to get consent into a specific type of sexual union, which is, of course, the monogamous married union.
Mm-hmm. And I think in your book you've quoted Louise Perry on a few occasions, but I really like her idea that she had sort of to understand the problem with consent, and part of it was that a lot of, for example, women that were in the sex industry, once they escaped from the sex industry and sort of set up their lives, the regret didn't only came then. When they were in it, they sort of found ways to talk themselves into it, that they are doing it for a reason and all that. But then there is also this problematic line, and let's say that we have the age of consent of 18, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an 18 or a 19-year-old girl on OnlyFans that is making money from, sleeping with 20 men in one day or 100 men in one day and putting it
On the
onto her
internet. Yeah.
subscribers, and all that is fine. But a woman that is a year younger, for example, but looks exactly the same way, that's not fine. Like, these women, for all intents and purposes, other than that arbitrary line of 18 is the age of consent, they are no different. So it's very actually difficult to set the consent and know that people will definitely not have regrets. And then I
Yeah.
think another point is we can't consent to something that we don't understand. And the idea of pushing the open relationships have got so many secondary and tertiary and all that effects that we simply just can't, as a democratic countries, really consent to what we are potentially going into.
Yeah. No.
And I think a lot of these effects have unfolded without us guessing that they will.
No, absolutely. I mean, you talk about, consent for, kids, people right on the line, but even consent among, grown adults is, I think, sometimes, murky at best. I, you know, go very much into this. There's a book called The Ethical Slut. Dan Savage, who is a
Yeah.
sex columnist podcaster here, he calls it the Hammurabi Code of polyamory. And so you have these two authors who kind of go into and talk about consent, and it's all necessary, but if you follow these rules where you make consent the main focus, then no one get hurt and everybody be fine and everyone can be sexually happy. But when you go and you read the book and you read these stories, you can see this consent just really turns into an emotional blackmail. And so, you have this story that she tries to tell, or not the one that she does tell, Noelle Easton, about one of her lovers, and about, how she was getting consent from her for it, but that her lover just could not get over the jealousy of her being with another person. And you're just watching Noelle Easton just constantly emotionally blackmail and beat this woman into submission to allow her to cheat on her. And it's just like, this woman clearly doesn't want to do it. Why are you keep forcing this issue? And of course, her line would be, well, she consented to all of it, so it's fine. But you have this woman crying and all the rest of it. And it's just like, no, this is clearly not working. If someone is so attracted to you and so bonded to you, they're going to lie to themselves about what their lines are in order to keep you, if they think that you'll leave them if you don't allow them to go on. And so it's just a window into why consent is just clearly not enough of a barrier to force humans to honestly, take in what their needs are and defend themselves, and to, get the type of relationships that they want.
Yeah. So obviously the consent is one of the issues. We touched upon that. And another one is the harm. So in terms of the direct harm, perhaps, a couple that does have open relationship and is quite happy with it doesn't really have like a huge impact. But then when we actually start looking at how their decisions are affecting other people within the society, those indirect harms are starting to pile up rather quickly.
Yes.
So can you talk us through some of the negative effects of any other relationship other than monogamy?
Right, sure. So, Jonathan Turley is a legal commentator here in the United States, and he's often viewed as conservative, and he is, but he used to be kind of more libertarian. And within the past decade, he has defended polygamous families in Utah, from prosecution. And so during this time, he wrote different op-eds for the New York Times, Washington Post, and his line was, "Look, what happens if it happens behind closed doors between consenting adults? Then it doesn't really affect you. So who cares?" But the problem with that statement is sex does not stay behind closed doors, most obviously because sex results still today, often with children. And so you can see throughout a number of issues just how much what happens behind closed doors does affect everyone. Marriage is a big driver of income inequality. Families that get and stay married are more successful Economically, they are less likely to go into bankruptcy, the more likely to make good decisions economically. It's also a main driver of wealth inequality. When you don't have divorces, when you're able to invest in a house. The example that I give at some point is like, well, if you have two businesses, one where the partners make a plan about what they're going to do, have a joint bank account, and invest in their future together, is that going to be a better or worse business than one where they're not committed to each other, they don't have any joint resources, and they just make decisions day to day? Of course, the company that has a vision and an investment in each other is going to be more wealthy at the end than the one that's not. And the same is true of marriage and this versus cohabitating couples. It also affects other households. When you look at social mobility, there's a great study, again, by another Harvard professor that looks at generational mobility. And it found that the single greatest factor within a neighborhood that determines whether or not the children of that neighborhood go on to be more economically successful than their parents isn't race or income or education. It's what the percentage of married fathers in homes. And so it's not just the father in the home with the child that matters. It's that there's more fathers in the neighborhood. And so it really is an issue of role modeling. And that, especially for young boys, that transition to manhood is so difficult, and you just don't know the proper way to act. And so when you have a neighborhood where there's no male fathers around, you just don't have any idea about what it looks like to be a man who provides for women, is kind to women, involves women in their lives, involves men in their lives, and is a protector and provider for the people around them. They just don't have that model. But when you have fathers around in the neighborhood, that lifts up the other children in that neighborhood to say, "Oh, look, that is what manhood looks like. That is what my goal looks like." And this study was so important for me. I lost my dad at a young age, but I was lucky enough to live in one of those neighborhoods where there always was tons of men on Boy Scouts, soccer teams, whatever else, where it wasn't even that they had to necessarily interact with me, but just be able to watch them interact with their own children was like, oh, that is what manhood is like. That is what the goal is. And when you have these neighborhoods where 80%, 90% of the children are do not have married fathers in the home, where are they supposed to look? And it's that deficit that really does end up affecting crime in these neighborhoods is a lot higher. Of course, the graduation rates are a lot lower. They're much more likely to end up in jail. So you just have all these issues where, what does go on behind closed doors does end up affecting everyone else in a really to a great significant extent.
I've always got this hypothesis, I suppose, about, because a lot of people do say that boys tend to be more affected by fatherlessness. And I come from a broken home, and I've always believed that women are affected to the same sort of severity. It's just they take it differently. And I sometimes wonder whether the choices that then women make when it comes to their own relationships, or whether to start a family or whether to delay it, for example, whether a lot of it would be coming down, would be like a downstream effect of fatherlessness. And a lot of these choices, or perhaps not wise choices, like all these men wouldn't be able to monopolize on short-term mating strategies if there were not enough women that would be willing to entertain it. And I think just the sheer number of women that are now willing to entertain that short-term mating strategy makes me think that that's how perhaps women sort of react to the lack of father in their homes, whilst men tend to turn a little bit more towards criminality, problematic behavior at school. So you can't really miss it. You can't miss the signs of sort of fatherless boys, really.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. First, when you look at the studies, it does affect the genders differently. So fatherlessness does affect, if women, well, girls who become women are then more likely to start having sex at a younger age, more likely to get divorced, less likely to get married. That's all true. But when you look at specifically like graduation rates and criminality and getting suspended from school, the effect on boys is much, much stronger. And there's another, again, this is actually another Harvard study, because, marriage, fatherlessness in marriage isn't like a on and off switch, right? You can start off without a father or start off with a father and get divorced later on. And so there's this one study out of Harvard where she tracks a generation, and she's able to go kind of year by year. And it really is amazing how for each additional year there's a father in the home, these children are more likely to graduate from school, more likely to go to college. So just that you can see the year by year increment. And again, it's the effect is much larger for boys. To your second point about women being much more willing to have these short, non-romantic relationships. This is an ethic. This is a value system that is pushed by feminists. As I detail in my book, Hannah Rosen, her book, literally titled "The End of Men," says that feminist progress is due entirely to the decline of marriage and the rise of hookup culture. She says that feminist professional progress is possible only because women are able to have these short sexual relationships so that they can then concentrate on career and profession instead of family life. And I think that ends up being horribly bad results for a lot of those young women down the road.
What an aspiration to have the end of all men.
Yeah, quite the book title.
Crazy. But I suppose there is that element in our culture and our society that is very, very anti-men, very anti-marriage. It's all patriarchy, it's all created by men to subjugate women. You've heard that reiterated so many times.
Right.
So let's actually give the devil its due. That there are circumstances in which women would be right to leave the marriage, but then talk to us a little bit more about the sort of that distinction between when, for example, the end of marriage would be right, and what can research tell us about that?
There is a little research on this. As long as there has been marriage, there has been divorce. Even hunter-gatherer tribes, you have marriage and divorce. Even the strictest Catholic regimes, between annulments and special pleadings to the Pope, you've always had marriage. So there is a question of when, is it probably good or not. And there is a lot of research onto this that says, look, there's a lot of so-called low conflict marriages, where you're not having emotional drag out fights, where there's not physical abuse, emotional abuse involved, but that where you do have still one of the partners, and the data is this is mostly driven by women. It's about 70% of all divorces are initiated by women, at least in the United States. And a lot of those divorces that are from low conflict actually do end up hurting both men and women, and of course the children. Further down the road, you do have lots of regret, especially on the male side, that I should have done more. I wish we would have gone to counseling. I wish we'd in some way to save this. And that felt very different than a high conflict divorce. Like when you're in a situation where either partner, but especially physically, the male partner is abusing, touching the woman in non-consensual, harmful ways. Yeah, get out of there, end that thing. But that's relatively rare as far as the number of divorces that you see in the United States today. Most often it is a low conflict situation where I don't want to say it that the women are completely unjustified in wanting to leave their men. Obviously they're unhappy, but I think a lot of those low conflict situations, both the man and the wife could do more to put more effort to it and save that relationship than to just cut the knot and move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of, your title of the book is Sex and the Citizen.
Yes.
And the subtitle is that essentially, I can't remember now word for word, but it's something that how
the
assault
assault
on marriage
on marriage is destroying democracy.
Thank you. Okay,
Absolutely.
so how does the assault on marriage destroy democracy? Because it's a big claim, and I think initially you kind of think, no way, that can't be right. So let's sort of start delineating all the layers of how it's affecting the societies.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, let's, first, I don't have the numbers for the United Kingdom memorized, or I probably don't even know them at all. But just to get a sense of what I mean when I talk about the assault on marriage, you know, we have the United States Census. Really the best numbers we have about married households start in like 1860, right after our Civil War. And so you have right there in the data, about 80% of all households in the United States were led by a married couple. And that was true up through the 1950s. And then it fell about a little bit in the 1960s. But then in the 1970s, it just completely started tanking to the point that by 2010, less than half of all households included a married couple in the United States. And it's still shrinking. Today, it's 45%. So, we're really it's a revolution in family form that a lot of people don't realize just how solid and how you know devoted to the married household the United States used to be as recently as 1970, and then now it's a minority instance. It's something that is common, but it's not the norm. It's not the cultural norm anymore. And so the point in my book is that has huge effects on the rest of society. And we touched a little on these earlier. We talked about income inequality. We talked about wealth inequality. We talked about social mobility, and crime. Well, when you look at the research on what income inequality does to democracy, the more income inequality you have, the harder it is to have democracy, the less democratic participation you have, the less trust you have in society, the more distrust you have in institutions. Same with wealth inequality, especially the same with social mobility. When you have a population that doesn't believe that by working hard, they can be at least as successful or more successful than their parents, that just completely undermines the legitimacy of that system, of that government in the populace's eyes. So anything that decreases social mobility is going to hurt democracy, which, of course, as we've covered, marriage does. Crime, you can't have high crime and expect people to turn out to the polls and have faith in results. There's tons of studies out of South America, particularly, showing how the faith of democracy and the strength of democratic institutions is highly dependent on low crime rates. And then we also touched on this earlier, the growing polarization that we have between young men and women. Again, also being driven by the decline in marriage, and also leading to push both parties to the extremes and leading to a decline in democracy. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, you have demographic decline. This is most visible in South Korea, where you have the population might shrink in half over the next 20 years. But without immigration, the United States population would be falling. And this is driven, at least in the United States, almost entirely by the decline of marriage, because married women have much more children than single women. But then you also have women that are delaying marriage. And of course, the longer a woman delays marriage, the later that she gets married, the fewer children she has. So if we were able to return to, just the marriage levels and age levels of marriage in the United States to the 1990s levels, then our population wouldn't be shrinking anymore. But marriage is still declining, so it is shrinking without immigration. But we can get back to those 1990s levels. I think we can get back to the 1960s levels, and I'm optimistic. But in those ways, with between income inequality, wealth inequality, decrease of social mobility, crime, isolation, demographic decline, these are all caused by the decline of marriage, and they all undermine democracy.
I think you can almost think about it as pieces of kindling, when you're just sort of stacking it all on top of each other, and then we've got the link between higher immigration and the lack of trust in society. So it's not just that inequality, but then the fact that now across the Western countries, all of them, or most of them, are relying on immigration to keep their population rising.
Yeah,
Last year
I
was the
mean,
first year
people really
where.
want to see their values being projected into future generations, right?
Mhm.
Not just their genes, but their values. And so when you have, your community all of a sudden being dominated by a culture that is alien to you, that you don't understand, you no longer feel like your way of life, like your values, are being projected into the future. And so, what am I doing here? Why am I participating? Why do I have faith in this government, in this society, if my way of life is being squelched out? And I think it's a
Mhm.
completely reasonable question for people to ask.
And a lot of the time when we are sort of discussing the marriage, because certain minorities, their rates of marriage are lower, a lot of people that are quite progressive or liberal in their views feel a little bit uneasy around recommending or prescribing marriage and monogamy, because they feel like it's I don't know, putting like another world's culture onto the minorities. But you've had a really interesting stats around the effect of the breakdown of marriage on minorities. And I think in the United States it is especially seen. So do you want to just give us some of the statistics surrounding that?
Well, so when you have family breakdown in the United States, it was the African American family that was affected first. So one of the big thesis of the book is that the African American family actually survived wonderfully after the Civil War, after the slaves were freed, and it got along great right up until the late 1960s, early 70s, where you had a Supreme Court case called King versus Smith that got rid of what are called man in the house rules, which before you had states that were allowed to go in and say, these households are not eligible for welfare benefits because they have an unmarried couple in them. And so King v. Smith got rid of that and said that you can no longer discriminate against unmarried households. But what that did do is it started discriminating against married households because it gave women then a choice. You could either, one, keep your welfare benefits, or two, get married. But if you got married, you'd lose your welfare benefits. So you're forcing a choice on poor women to choose. You either had to choose to be married to the state or married to a man. And for a number of reasons, and we're talking about 1960s, 1970s here, there was a lot more discrimination, a lot more African American men were a lot less successful economically. So this choice hit African American women first. And so it was in that decade right after King v. Smith during the 70s that the bottom just really completely fell out of the African American families. It went from like 55% of African American women being married between the ages of 18 and 24 down to like 20% by the 80s, and it never recovered. So this forced choice of choosing between married to the state and married to a man has just been a disaster. First for minority communities, but then it has spread to other populations and other cultures, both here and I believe in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, United Kingdom has got the taxation system which is actively punishing marriages, especially if a woman, most likely it will be a woman, who would want to stay in the house to look after their young children. That is actively being penalized by the states in the form of taxation. Um, but I suppose that how do we then design the system which incentivizes marriage and has still got that flexibility to really catch those broken families who really do need help? It's not for them, it's not like a choice on a spreadsheet whether column A or column B is more beneficial. But we know that there will be some people that are genuinely in need of help from the state.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's for on the United States side. I can't speak for the United Kingdom, but from what I do understand, your welfare system also has marriage penalties built into it. But you just need to stop punishing marriage. You just need to say, if you were eligible for this program before you were married, whether it's food stamps, whether it's Section 8 housing, whether it's Medicaid, or health insurance subsidies in the United States. I realize that you guys don't have that, but these are all programs that in the United States actually do pun- uh, punish marriage, and you can see it in the stats. When the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was rolled out here in the United States, the Supreme Court held in 2014 that states had a choice about whether they could take the Medicaid expansion or not. So just as with gambling, like we discussed earlier, this then created a natural experiment where some states added the Medicaid expansion before others. And so you could look at the effect on marriage. And it did decrease marriage. And again, right in the populations we would expect it to. Those, kind of low skill, low income populations where they're right on the line, whether or not you were eligible for Medicaid, those are the exactly populations where you saw marriage fall. So there's so many different reforms here in the United States that look at just the child tax credit, or look at just welfare, or look at just food stamps. And they all have different lines on which how often they punish marriage, or what income levels they do. And most poor people don't know the exact lines, absolutely. But there is this knowledge out there. There is this correct idea out there that if you get married, you are less likely to be eligible for a whole bunch of programs. That's all people really need to know, right? And so we need to reverse that. We need to make clear through policy changes and then through public education that, look, that's no longer the case. We've changed the eligibility for these programs so that even if you do choose to get married, you are still eligible for these programs. So at least on the United States side, I think that would be a huge positive step in the right direction. But then there's so many other things you could do to help it. You look at childcare, here in the United States, very expensive. And that a lot of it has to do with regulations. You have, my mom was able to, get somebody just in the neighborhood who is, looking after a bunch of kids in her house. That would never happen in California today. You have to have, the right training. You have to have the right staff ratios. You have to have the right building health code violations. You have the right number of fire extinguishers. All that drives up the cost. And so there's just so many small solutions that generations before were able to come to on informal levels that just don't exist today. And so you deregulate all those in order to give them more of a chance. But then you also just have to go back and attack the whole premise of the feminist movement that says the decline of marriage and the rise of hookup culture is necessary for feminist success, for female success. And I don't believe that's true. And I think, we need to make it clear that, look, there are career paths. You can be happy by getting married young, still pursuing a career, going back, going to more school, getting education to change professions, or whatever else there is. There's definitely things we can do to help working moms get back into work that I think would make it easier for more women to embrace the idea that I can be successful and be professionally successful and still be married.
I think certainly in both states and the United Kingdom, we have the women now that are married to the state instead of the husbands, and their children are now being brought up by the state instead of by the mothers. Because the childcare system, for example, in the UK, I know in the States, you have hardly any maternity at all in terms of maternity leave. We in the United Kingdom do have maternity leave, but there are provisions open, and quite a lot of employers do push for women to go back to work ASAP. And certainly any incentives by the government are all about returning women to work quicker. So it's not about keeping them at home if they want to stay at home, which a lot of them do. It's all about just returning them back to the economy, because then you've not only got two people in the households that are working, ideally, but then you also got a childminder and they are all paying taxes.
Yes.
whilst
No,
whilst
no. I
if
mean,
the woman would be staying home,
right,
then that takes quite a lot out of the taxation
right, right.
pot.
Your two thoughts. So one, I mean, this was the point that J.D. Vance made throughout his campaign, was that the United States right now, the whole point is to try to push women into the workplace, when mothers into the workplace, when perhaps they don't want to be there. And the data show that actually a lot of them do not. Most of them would rather work part time while they are raising young, not full time. But this is just a huge divide between the parties, because the Democratic Party absolutely does want to push mothers back into the workforce full time as quickly as possible. In fact, there's a Biden policy paper that said exactly this. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about demographic decline, but the Biden White House, after a census report that showed the United States, without immigration, the population was declining. The White House actually put out a white paper, a policy paper, on how to address that. And of course, it wasn't limiting immigration. It wasn't raising male wages. It was none of those things. The way the Biden administration wants to address demographic decline is to raise female workforce participation. One of the ways being to push mothers back into the workforce as quickly as possible. The thinking being, the more women you have working, that makes up for the fact that there's less workers overall in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so literally their solution to demographic decline is to have mothers work more, which of course is the
and
polar
speed
opposite.
up the demographic decline.
Which of course is the polar opposite solution that the Republicans are offering.
Right.
But that's the ideological battle we're having in the United States today, and hopefully more in the United Kingdom as well soon.
Yes, I would definitely hope so. So obviously, I mean, you've got the Republican government taking office very soon. All the political figures that I trust tend to believe that we are like a one election cycle behind you, and unless the Labour government and all the politicians at the front of that government have a complete brain transplant, I can't see how they're going to win another election, because they have been dreadful on like literally every single decision that they make right now is a terrible one. So hopefully we will have a more sane government next time round, but this one isn't going to do anything towards addressing the immigration, the falling birth rates. And I've spoken to quite a few people about the birth rates. It's a very, very worrying trend. And I still don't think that people recognize just what a massive change that is going to be globally. And just how much upheaval that is going to cause unless we manage to reverse it.
Yeah, I mean, the immigration one's tough. I mean, because correct me if I'm wrong here, but the government you guys had before this one was a conservative one, and they didn't do anything on lowering immigration levels. In fact, my understanding, they made it worse.
Our conservatives are only conservatives in name. I describe them as wet lettuce liberals.
Right. And
there is nothing conservative about them.
And I mean, we had the same problem here. I mean, the Republican president before Trump, Bush, pushed a mass amnesty when he was president. So, finding conservatives that are willing to actually enforce the immigration laws is tough. We have luckily found one in Donald Trump, for the rest of his faults, which are many. But one thing the guy does do is enforce immigration laws that Democrats won't. And you can go back, you can look at the immigration levels in the United States when he was president, and they fell. So he got results. Which maybe you guys can find some conservatives that actually are willing to lower levels and follow through on their promises on that. But it's tough to find. It's tough to find.
Yeah, we do have some reshuffling within the parties, and there's actually an upcoming party called Reform that only days ago are now polling at the same level as Labour. So now they are officially sort of the opposition in terms of the public support. So we will see whether they will actually manage to build a proper sort of party, because they are new kids on the block, so they don't have that political structure and foundations underneath them. So they've got an awful lot of catching up to do. But if they can pull it off, it's going to be a major change in the United Kingdom next sort of election. So one last thing that I wanted to touch upon on the question of marriage, and I suppose, again, trying to give the devil his due, a lot, I've heard that many times, that we humans, we are just not made to be monogamous, and that even birds, who are another species that are largely monogamous, tend to stray, and that monogamy as sort of an institution is just somehow goes against our nature. What have you got to say about that?
All bunk, all Huey. No, I'm glad you brought up birds, because for a long time, scientists used to think birds were 100% strictly monogamous, and it wasn't until they were able to check DNA that they realized, oh my, birds actually do get out a lot. And so, yeah, I mean, birds actually are doing monogamous, but there is a lot of cheating that goes on among birds. The good news on that front is that humans are actually cheat a lot less than birds do. It depends on the culture involved, but for most cultures, the rate of cuckoldry among children is just a lot lower. Like we're talking like 2-3%, compared to as high as like 30% among some bird species. So and that's because of culture. So there's a number of ways in which human culture has affected our very anatomy. And the example I like to use, because I don't think it's political at all, most people kind of instantly grasp this, is cooking. Is that everyone understands that cooking is culture. No human is born knowing how to cook. But our intestines are so much smaller than other species like us, like apes, etc. And that's all because of we've had cooking culture for so long that the digestion that takes place, that used to take place in the body, now take place out of the body in cooking. And so that is one way in which culture has changed our very DNA, our very physiology. And the same is true of monogamy. Monogamy, as I discussed in the very first chapter, in the very earliest chapter, is the reason why we are different than the apes, is the reason why we have cultural learning, is the reason why we are so smart, is the reason why we're able to adapt and conquer all 7 continents. And it is because we form these long-term pair bonds. It's because both the cultural norms within hunter-gatherer societies and then our own genes, specifically the chemicals within our body, vasopressin specifically, that binds us to our sexual partners, that then makes us more likely to form these strong emotional bonds. Now, are there some desires within us that we're physiologically bound to that force us beyond monogamy? Sure, there is, men want to dominate, and they want to have as many sexual partners as possible. But that's also true of other things that we see that out of the context of a hunter-gatherer society can get out of hand. Just look at obesity and our desire for sugar, right? So, in hunter-gatherer set, that, hunger we have for sugar is satiated by the fact that we're constantly moving, and, we're don't have enough. We're not sedentary, and so we're moving a lot more. And there's just not enough we're not getting enough sugar to that we become fat. Mm-hmm. We're moving way too much, so that when we do, we at least burn it off. And the same is true actually of monogamy, in that, as I detail in the book, pretty much all hunter-gatherer tribes that are nomadic that have ever been encountered were monogamous. It wasn't until we became sedentary, it wasn't until we had agriculture, that you started to see polygamy start happening. That system worked for a long time. Pretty much every empire you can think of in the past was polygamous. And I kind of take a world tour through the book.
Yeah.
You can look at China, Japan, India, of course, Mali and Africa. But even in Europe, the Vikings were famously polygamous. And that was a successful mating strategy for a long time. But then you had Christianity come along through kind of both Greek and Roman society, and that's where it started. It evolved like anything else. But then with Christianity, you had a full on commitment to monogamy, and it was a cultural form that ended up catching on. And as I describe in the book, by breaking down patriarchal clan structures through that marriage family program I talked about earlier, that
Mm-hmm.
created the building blocks for civil society through guilds and universities, and then that allowed for both democracy and the Industrial Revolution to came along. And because monogamous marriage so successfully channels our sexual desires into what I call long-term projects of cooperative care, where men and women come together to help their children, but also the grandparents are then able to come in. Only because of monogamy can grandparents identify who their grandchildren are and then help. So through these long-term projects of cooperative care, you have a lot more cooperation helping between individuals. And that's really why the West won. That is why you had the West go on and conquer the rest of the world. And so then in the 1700s, 1800s, you have countries recognize this. They say, look, monogamy does seem to be the better instance. And so between, I think it was like 1850 and 1910, you had India, China, Russia, all these countries that had never outlawed polygamy before all began to outlaw polygamy and moved, straight into monogamy. So it didn't happen everywhere. You
Mm-hmm.
still have about 25% of the world, population-wise, lives in countries where polygamy is either predominantly practiced or is outright legal. But 75% of the world lives in monogamous cultures where monogamy is enforced through law. And that's rare in human history. That was just not true for the past 10,000 years up until, Christianity started spreading.
Mm. But I think as well there is something just inherently, despite a lot of these like really progressive or feminists claiming that open relationships and all that is for the benefit of women. When you look at the places where polygamy is still practiced today, they're certainly not the type of countries where women have got the most freedoms, rights, or choices, I suppose. So
Right,
it's a
right.
there's a bit of the there is a bit of reconciliation there that I think needs to be happening between the feminist movement and perhaps a little bit more of the nod to the tradition and recognition that it's not just patriarchy, that it's not. I think we've just got that tendency to really disqualify tradition as useless and remove it without really understanding just how much we rely on these traditions
Yeah, I
in
mean,
our
the,
current societies.
the argument I would make would be that monogamous marriage is a huge force against patriarchal families, and that when we speak of the patriarchy, what we're talking about is powerful men dominating everyone else, and the counter to that is the nuclear family, where you have men and women in partnerships together that kind of form their own lives and are able to decide what they want to do with their lives. And when the church was first forming, Christianity was hugely popular, mostly among women. And it was because that the church afforded so many opportunities for women, both in the leadership, but as equal partners spiritually within the church, that it spread. And so much of Christianity spread through women and through marriage. Constantine, the Roman emperor that legalized Christianity, he didn't make it as some people, he didn't make Christianity the state religion of Rome. That came later, but he did legalize it. But he was introduced to Christianity from his mother. His father was pagan, but his mother was Christian. That's how he learned about the religion. The Carolingian dynasty, that was also, you had pagan men marrying Catholic women who didn't convert them immediately, but eventually did. So you have the Carolingian Empire was spread and passed that way. But again, it was often through women that the church spread, and so I think feminists today have just lost touch with the reality that the best way to counteract true patriarchal power, true patriarchal culture, is through reciprocal monogamous marriage.
That was the bit that I've really enjoyed actually about your book. It was one of these parts that was really missing in other books that were perhaps written that were pro marriage. Certainly that sort of walk through the history and how we evolved and how different cultures arrived at monogamy, and their sort of journey through trying these different family structures. That was fascinating, and I've learned a lot there. So for anyone that wants to dive more into these topics, your book, Sex and the Citizen, is brilliant, highly recommended. And for people that want to find out a little bit more about what you do, where can they find you online?
Oh, well, I'm on Twitter way too much. I'm sorry, X. So just follow me at X at Conn Carroll. Yeah, X at Conn Carroll. And then I'm also at the Washington Examiner. So WashingtonExaminer.com.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I give you Conn Carroll.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.